Welcome to the Global Philosophy of Religion project at the University of Birmingham, led by Professor Yujin Nakasawa. We at Closer to Truth are pleased to present these discussions. Today we explore Process Philosophy and Theology with Dr. Andrew Davis, a philosopher, theologian, and scholar of world religions. He is Program Director for the Center of Process Studies at Claremont School of Theology at Willamette University. He is author or editor of several books, including How I Found God in Everyone and Everywhere, an anthology of spiritual memoirs, Mind, Value, and Cosmos on the relational nature of ultimacy, and the forthcoming Process Cosmology, New Integrations in Science and Philosophy. Andrew, welcome. It's great to see you. We're going to stress today understanding process thinking, philosophy, and theology and metaphysics in its own context, and then, if and where relevant, in comparison with other religions. It's important for our Global Philosophy of Religion project to interrelate traditions by eliciting responses to similar theological and metaphysical questions. So let's start with a brief overview of process philosophy and theology, a little bit of the history, the major personalities, and some of the big categories of philosophical content.
Well, thank you, Robert. Okay, well, modern process philosophy and theology are schools of thought that have arisen largely in the 19th and 20th century, largely because of the expansive work of Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy. Whitehead was a mathematician and philosopher, and later in life turned to metaphysics and speculative philosophy with primary interest in cosmology and how to frame an understanding of the universe with attention to the fact that it is ultimately becoming. Human experience for Whitehead bears witness to the fact that creative temporality and movement and change can be read back over nature in a deep and fundamental way. But it should be said as well that it's not just a 20th century creation. So if we look back to ancient intuitions of process throughout our traditions, they're also there. So ancient Buddhist thought, ancient Chinese thought, for example, in Taoist and Confucian sages, and of course in the historical records of Western thought in ancient Greece, we have thinkers like Heraclitus, arguably the founder of ancient process philosophy, who says you cannot step in the same river twice. So process thinkers throughout this tradition are involved with thinking metaphysically, that is, about the nature of reality, what populates the nature of reality, and with what kind of character. And they do so in a way that prioritizes becoming rather than being, that being itself is an outgrowth of becoming. Now, I mentioned Whitehead, and of course, he's a preeminent exponent of this style of thinking, but it's important to also see that Whitehead, both before him and after him, there's also other influential process voices. So Hegel, for example, would be an important process voice. Bergson, Teilhard de Chardin, Samuel Alexander, William James, Schelling, Peirce, a number of other philosophers who are thinking about the world in this organic, developmental, and deeply processual and experiential way. And so in addition to philosophy, theology, and religion, process style thinking has roots in psychological thought. We're making inroads in ethical and moral and aesthetic thought, political thought as well, and certainly different dimensions of social thought. So it's surrounding this prioritization of becoming, of process, of evolution, all the way down and potentially all the way up in nature into the theological and religious sphere.
The fundamental point I hear is that becoming is more fundamental than being, and that's certainly a radical proposition that many would take issue with.
That's right. That's right. So again, to look at the history of metaphysics, this discussion as to permanence and change and which takes priority has been a very important one. Well, for process thinkers, and for Whitehead in particular, he's a radical empiricist in the sense that he's unwilling to dismiss any mode of human experience. And that's important because he holds a more fundamental conviction that human beings are a part of the natural world. We didn't plop into the world from somewhere. We grew out of the universe, in a sense, like a flower grows out of soil. And if that's the case, then certain dimensions and characters, domains of our experience can be skillfully, carefully read back over nature and potentially into the deepest level of things. So for Whitehead, the deepest dimension of reality is an actual occasion. It's an event that it is constituted by the fact that it is becoming. It influences from the past, it receives and contemplates possibilities of the future, and it makes a decision. And so at the fundamental base of things is this experiential process that in human experience is exemplified in a very intense way. But experience goes all the way down in the natural world for Whitehead and for process thinkers.
Okay, great. Now we're going to focus on the process approach to God because this first theme of the Global Philosophy of Religion project deals with the existence and nature of God or deities, depending upon the tradition. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So let's start with God. What is God? Please define or describe the process conception of God briefly.
Okay, well, I'll do so by quoting Whitehead, and this is one of his most important statements with respect to God, and that is that God is not to be treated as a great exception to metaphysical principles. Rather, he is their chief exemplification. Now, what I just mentioned with respect to human experience is the fact that we receive influence from the past, the physical stubbornness of the past. It's our physical pole, Whitehead says. But we also entertain and contemplate the future in terms of modes of possibility, possibilities of value. And so Whitehead sees every event, including the divine event, this everlasting event, as having these physical and these mental poles. And with the mental pole, Whitehead conceives God's primordial nature, as he calls it, as permanent and necessary mentality. It is unchanging. It is the ground of infinite possibility and value. And yet, God is not just that alone. For Whitehead, God also has a consequent nature. It's that element of the divine that is really and truly related with the world in its temporal becoming. Therefore, it's an element of God that is contingent, that is changing, that is experiential. And so, one way is that helpful to think about this is if we think about you, for example, you have a steadfast character that we've watched over Closer to Truth interviews for years, but your experience in every moment has changed. And so that the understanding of God is one that brings together permanence and change, transience and permanence in a deep way, and argues that these are not inconsistent in an image of God.
Yeah, that's the challenge that many traditions transcendence and the immanence. But one thing you said I think was critical, and that is that God is the exemplification of these deep metaphysical truths. That would make God, in a sense, inferior in an explanatory way or a causation way to these metaphysical truths. We can call them Platonic forms or whatever we want. But is that a fair uh, assumption, a fair deduction from what you said?
Well, that's always the quick worry that people have, but it is something to be God. It's not just nothing. And so process thinkers are making this claim again from an analysis of our own experience, and certainly not just that. What the sciences give us in different ways as well. Whitehead was very concerned with that. But to begin with our own experience, to locate ourselves in the world as exemplifications of metaphysical principles, and then to say that God, rather than being the great exception to those principles, leaving us with nothing to say of God, chiefly exemplifies them. So it gives us a starting point to work in a continuous way from ourselves, from the base of reality, all the way up, presumably, to the supreme exemplification of these principles.
Is that an epistemological claim in terms of our capacity to know, or is it an ontological claim in terms of what God is in God's own self?
Yes, well, it is an ontological claim. Of course, the epistemology would be limited. We do our best to navigate these principles and identify them in our experience. But in principle, God is not foreign to the dimensions of our own experience. And this is an important claim when process theology makes the claim that we're dealing with not a supernatural divinity in the sense that God is utterly different in kind from the metaphysical principles, but a natural divinity in the sense that God's working with the world is internal within the world and the principles which govern the world itself, and not exterior, so that interventions could happen. So there's a larger debate about how God relates to metaphysical principles. Does God establish them, or does God exemplify them? And I think that's an interesting debate that process thought is willing to encounter.
Okay, it's good. It's good that it's a debate as opposed to a characterization of the whole way of thinking that the metaphysical claims come first and God is derivative or the exemplification of that. But it's a
Yes,
it,
but the claim, of course, wouldn't be made that God is derivative or inferior to them in some sense.
okay.
So we push back on that.
You've written the interesting statement that the necessity of our actions is helping God to actually be God. I have some friends who think that's pretty blasphemous.
Well, that's okay. Yes. So one question that has been asked and answered in various ways is, what does the world give God? Does God need the world in a deep sense? Now, classical and traditional modes of thinking based in Greek thought said that God's necessity is absolute, that God is impassible and ultimately unrelated. God doesn't ultimately need a world. In this sense, God is ontologically independent in a very deep sense. And yet, this seems to raise some deep issues for religious traditions who picture God, at least in my sort of Protestant background, the biblical traditions in a deep way, that is really related to the world, that is in a relationship with the world. And what that means, if we take it seriously, is that God is affected by the world, and that the world, in some sense, can add to the life of God. So briefly, the way in which process thinkers and Whitehead, in a more complicated way, envisions divine action in the world is God meets the world with provision of possibility. God is the creator in the sense of granting the world its own self-creation, but the world itself is what chooses to actualize the possibilities that God grants. And for God to appreciate merely possible things is different from God to appreciate actual things. And so the world's gift to God in a deep sense, the world actualizes in a deep way the possibilities God offers, and God is impacted by that. God is, you wouldn't say learning, not necessarily improving, but God is in a deep relational way, appreciating what the world itself offers by virtue of the world's freedom.
It sounds like we're moving the process God to a panentheistic God where the world is in God, but God transcends the world as well.
Right. Well, panentheism is certainly a wider discussion than simply process philosophy. It's sort of an umbrella term. But on the whole, process thinkers do like that term, that concept for thinking about God, where God is in the world and the world is in God, and there's a mutuality between them. So they wouldn't want to affirm theism to the extent that God is independent from the world and ultimately doesn't need a world. They wouldn't want to affirm pantheism to the extent that it is envisioned that God collapses into and as the world themselves. They would critique both of these as extremes in a deep way. So panentheism becomes a way of affirming the independence but inseparability of God and the world for each other. And of course, not every process thinker will use the language of panentheism. Roland Faber uses trans-pantheism. So there's different ways of communicating that vision, but it's one of independent inseparability, of mutual immanence.
So if we would use Venn diagrams, just an example, between process theology and panentheistic theology, would they be non-overlapping Venn diagrams like that? So there'd be part that each could have explanatory or different types of theories that the other would not.
I think so. It wouldn't be the case that there's simply a circle that represents God and another circle inside of it that represents the universe. It's far too static in nature. So there's an independence. In addition to a mutual immanence, a mutual transcendence. That God and the world have functions that are essential to their relationship to one another. That in a way they live through each other in this sort of deeply intimate vision.
Okay, that's a great answer, but that was not the question I was asking. But I was going to ask that, so it's great to answer the relationship between God and the universe. What I was asking, so I'm glad you did that. That was great. The
Okay.
question is from a conceptual point of view of the process God and the panentheistic God. If we have those as two explanatory systems, how overlapping are those two explanatory systems? And I posed it to where there's overlap, but each has theories or things that it does that would be outside of the other.
Right. Yes. So there is some overlap, but again, we wouldn't want to equate panentheism as such with process thinking. There's Eastern Orthodox affirmations of panentheism, and arguably classical affirmations of panentheism too, where God is present to the world in the most intimate possible way. But the reverse is not necessarily true. In that sense, the world is not in God in the sense of having an effect on God in every single moment. And process wants to make that mutuality apparent. It's not just the case that God is in the world, but vice versa.
What I'm trying to do is to distinguish process theology from some of the other things that we've covered, and and panentheism seems the closest, but to distinguish the two as well. Okay,
Yes.
let's on. What kinds of arguments does process theology make for the existence of God? Or because in other traditions, certainly the Abrahamic traditions, there are arguments for the existence of God. Does process theology bother with that?
It depends on the process thinker, but as a whole, absolutely, process theology and philosophy is interested in these arguments. And there's two sort of domains of argumentation that we might list. One would be those arguments surrounding the general features of the world. Okay, so arguments, for example, surrounding metaphysical order, or arguments surrounding cosmological order, different sort of dimensions. There's arguments surrounding teleology and axiology, or arguments, for example, surrounding the reality of possibility and radical novelty. So that would be one, or maybe even excessive beauty beyond what seems to be demanded by utility. And so if the general feature of the world is one, another category that process thinkers have used, of course, and this gets back to this emphasis on human experience, is different aspects of human experience. So, for example, arguments from truth in human life and human experience, arguments from different domains of value, whether aesthetic, whether rational, whether moral and ethical. And of course, the data of religious or mystical experience would be an important dimension of any argumentation, and including wider forms of exceptional experience. So process thinkers recently have taken an interest in psychedelic experience, near-death experience, out-of-body experience, and various domains in the paranormal world. Not to jump on anything that anyone says is true, but to say that there's the data of experience is important, because human beings are an exemplification and not an exception to everything that's going on. And so we reason carefully with respect to what our experience presents us.
Okay, so then how then would the process thinking in arguments for God differ from those that we're used to in the Abrahamic traditions, and particularly in philosophy, where they've derived from? And it sounds like there is a mutual utilization of the standard kinds of proofs that Aquinas, cosmological and teleological arguments, but you're expanding it, this experiential thing, to aspects of beauty and truth and morality that Christian philosophers will use too, but not in a very intense way.
It's a great point. Yes, the difference is philosophical, though. So process thinkers, um, not unlike the way that say Augustine utilized the metaphysics of Plato and Plotinus, and the way Aquinas, for example, would use that of Aristotle, process thinkers are looking to Whiteheadian metaphysics as a lens into rethinking the nature of reality, and that includes argumentation. So we're using argumentation for God. We're using different philosophical assumptions and affirmations to argue for a different kind of God. One of the big critiques of the classical tradition, Charles Hartshorne called it monopolarity, is that it affirmed a one-sided nature of God. It said God is only independent, only necessary, completely unchanging, only unaffected. And yet there's another side to what it would mean to affirm a true relationality between God and the world, where God is changing. God is dependent, in a sense, in the way of being affected. God is also temporally in process with the world. So to the extent that Kant and others have said that all the theological arguments have failed, fair enough. But we're not arguing about that God. There's a different understanding of God that process thought is trying to get at in a deep way.
Okay, what kind of God is most worthy of worship? And does the process God fit this worship worthy model? Because, in one sense, some would say that you're decreasing the ultimacy or the omnipotence or the aseity of God by this relational interaction. So by lowering, as some would say, would that take the process God below the standard of worship worthiness?
Not in the least, at least as process thinkers have argued. So this has been a very important question, obviously. It's an important question for me. Um, if God is a great exception, God is independent and non-related. Um, if God has absolute brute power, these are all important dimensions of the tradition, but how are any of these grounding our gratitude for being, our worship for God? So I think that in process thought, there is a fundamental conviction that God is good. And in Christian process theology, certainly, not only Christian, that God is also love. And so when it comes to thinking about a God worthy of worship, power, independence, isolation are not on the table for the kinds of things that derive our worship um, or our response in a deep way. You may fear an omnipotent God, but worship and fear don't seem to blend together in a deep way. I mean, there's arguments about that. So for me, for process thinkers generally, God's goodness is affirmed. And if God's power needs to be rethought to preserve the life of God's goodness, then that's okay. So a God worthy of worship for me is a God that lives through the supremacy of its own goodness. That goodness itself is what God is and the foundation of God's being. And therefore that goodness is the reason, the rationale for the world, and in some sense points the arc of human purpose in the world towards goodness and value as well. So I've called it worship ontological gratitude at its basic level, because we are, in a sense, thankful for we're grateful for being and the fact that we ourselves exemplify some dimension of value. So there's a compass of value, and I think process thought is concerned to preserve that in God. And power doesn't come into play when it comes to worship. We think that's, on the whole, a slip to barbaric modes of thinking.
Well, I won't defend barbarism here, but I do want to relationship between value or goodness, which you have typified, and in your writings you have, and others have,
Yes.
and the primacy. In fact, the truth may demand the truth maker. You see as God relying upon or supervening on value and goodness. And if that is true, and I think it is true in terms of process thinking, where value and goodness becomes a primacy, doesn't that elevate that abstract concept above the concept of God? That God has to exceed and exemplify this overarching concept of value.
Right, great question, and I know you and I share respect and love, perhaps, for the philosophies of John Leslie and Keith Ward. So my entry point into thinking about value and the robustness of the claim that value is at the base of existence is due to John Leslie's work. Now, my critique of Leslie is that it is very hard to think of an abstract, independent value floating in some metaphysical void actually doing anything. So this is a debate in philosophy. How can abstractions actually do anything? So I think that I wouldn't want to say that value is over and above God in more of a supreme sort of way, but that God's deepest nature is ethically required, to use Leslie's words, is a supreme exemplification of value. But that value in itself requires the mediation of mind. And this is where you come to think a bit about not simply one thing as ultimate. So you're assuming when you say, God is lesser than, value is more than, you're assuming that we can adjudicate greater and lesser ultimates, if you want. The claim I think Whitehead would remind us of, and he doesn't do this exactly, but I developed my thinking a little bit off him, is that there's a utter relationality among ultimate realities wherein they cannot be abstracted from each other. I think there's an interesting way to make a case for divine necessity as the mutual immanence of mind and value. And that means that the relationality between these domains and God transcends either of the functions of only one of them. God is, in a deep way, a relational fusion of abstract and concrete states. Abstract value, which is the ethical requirement for God's existence, and concrete mind, which is the only context in which creative value makes sense. But that's a much, it got deep all of a sudden, but that's a different discussion.
That's what Closer to Truth is all about. So
absolutely.
Watch John Leslie and Keith Ward on Closer to Truth and many videos. What's the role of religious or mystical experiences in process philosophy and theology and the understanding as part of the worship process of God? You write, crossing the religious mystical bridge into God. What does that mean?
Okay, well, that phrase, in fact, comes from the work of Paul Knitter, the great comparative theologian. That was used by me in an older sort of paper. But the basic gist of it is that, again, to speak to something we've said already, is that human experience in all of its variety, in its surface levels and its depths, provides data that is worth extending, worth utilizing and thinking back over all the way down, and back up, if you want, all the way toward the reality of God. So mystical experience is something that process thinking has to be open to in a deep way. These moments of, even if rare, of clarity, of openness, of revelation, that means something about the nature of things. They don't mean nothing, they mean something. And human beings have arisen in the universe and have these experiences that are incredibly significant in a deep way. If you know anyone who've had or claimed to have a mystical experience, I can't claim I have. This is an experience that impacts the rest of their life. So we take that seriously.
But you don't require it.
We don't require it. But I should say that Whitehead's philosophy is through and through experiential. So the framework for mystical experience is one that is already a deepening of an already experiential philosophy. Experience for Whitehead goes all the way down, what David Ray Griffin calls Whitehead's pan-experientialism.
According to process theology, do all or most religions worship the same God?
I'd say on the whole, process thinkers would answer that in the negative. They've generally been very critical of perennialist style pluralism that wants to say that the diversity of all religions in a deep way can be reduced to one divine well. Instead, they've talked about what's called deep pluralism or differential pluralism, which says that what these different religions, these diverse religions are saying can potentially be real with respect to the nature of things. And this, again, gets to the point that ultimacy is not a matter of simply just one thing. So what does a Buddhist have right that a Christian needs to know? Or what does a Christian have right that a Buddhist could be deepened by? So we've spoken of mutual transformation of traditions through the basic conviction that reality is, how would you say, complex enough to house multiple truths in different ways. So we want to honor traditions and not just reduce them to one thing. Traditions have wildly different experiences, and it's very hard to reduce them to the simple label of God, which some don't use at all.
But is the claim that process theology can somehow unite the vast divergence between the two examples you use, Buddhism that does not have a theistic God at all, and Christianity, which not only has a personal God, but it has the incarnation of Jesus Christ as a former member of the Trinity Godhead.
Right. So process theology itself, of course, is quite diverse. So we'll speak about how process theologians in particular would say it. There's no one prescribed way. But it would be the claim that what Buddhism is saying about the nature of reality, for example, there's an element of reality that is really true in that sense. Say the emptiness, the no formness, the creative dimension of the world. But that is impersonal in a deep sense. There's a sense in which reality has and holds a place for that. Just as for Buddhists, perhaps there is a personal dimension that Christians are thinking about that are expressing in their doctrines of God that really needs to be taken account of. So it's this notion that reality is diverse enough to allow for multiple affirmations of ultimacy and multiple affirmations of truth, not in a way that reduces or completely contradicts what religions are saying. Obviously, it's a very hairy conversation, but in a way that honors the diversity by matching it with a diverse reality.
It would take a longer conversation to determine how coherent that is, but we'll leave that for another time.
Certainly.
Let's move on to the traits of God in process theology. I think I know the answer to the first question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is it proper to describe the process God as a person, a personal being with personhood features like awareness and intent and will?
I think it is proper. Now, I mentioned that Whitehead has a dimension of God that is necessary, that is the ground of the possible, that is mind in a deep sense, and God has an active dimension that is conscious, that has will, that has impact, and that is deeply related to the world. Now, God feeds the world with possibility in every single moment, and this can be conceived as God's provision, particular providence for particular occasions, is what Whitehead and process thinkers have said. It's the will of God for each particular occasion. So I think when you think about these consciousness and you think of the provision of value and possibility and of will, all those can be summarized in the language of personhood. But again, that's a more of a complicated conversation too. We'd want to add more to that.
What are specific attributes of God? In particular, how does the process God relate to the perfect being theology traditionally in Christian philosophy? All the omnis, omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, the all-powerful kinds of traits.
Yes, well, perfect being theology has affirmed a classical understanding of divine attributes: all power, omnibenevolence, all knowledge, omniscience, omnibenevolence, all goodness. And process thought has a different take on these things. For one, process thought does not think that perfection requires complete unchangingness in the life of God, nor does it require complete independence. And now, if the world is one of creative advance, this means something about the world's God. And so when we process thinkers think about omniscience, God does not determine and or know the future as actual, because part of what it means to be the future is to be non-actual. What God knows is the possibilities of what can be within certain degrees.
So it's distinguish these characteristics in two categories. You're talking about the, and I think those are, you have timelessness, you have changelessness, you have impassibility. Those aspects of God. Then there are the so-called powers of God, the omnipotence, omniscience, the goodness. So I want to talk about them in two senses. You're clearly showing that the process God contradicts the traditional perfection of changelessness being the highest perfection, and therefore God has to have it. I think that's a position that has been debated within Abrahamic traditions. I happen to be on the process side on that for a little bit.
Wonderful.
But one category. But so we agree that the process as God changing in time, affect, not impassible. Okay, but what about those powers? Is God powerful? Omniscience. If you can't know the future, it's not a hit against omniscience. If it's not something to be known. So, but does the process God know everything that can be known, or can do anything that can be done?
Great question. Yes, and knowledge and power, of course, are related. So as you said, God knows the past, the present, but the future, by definition, is unsettled. And God knows it as a range of possibilities. And it's important to say that, too, for process thinkers to preserve the reality of human freedom. There is a large debate about if the future for you and I tomorrow, the next day, in 5 years is utterly known already, then can we choose otherwise? So process thinkers are keen to preserve the reality of freedom. There's also a dimension, and this will get us to talking about power, of the problem of evil here. Does God know that Auschwitz is going to take place before it does? And if so, could it have not have? Concomitantly, does God have the power to stop that type of event? Process thinkers rethink divine knowledge. We rethink power as necessarily persuasive rather than coercive. And what that means is God can't stop the horrendous evils that happen. This is
Can't, can't, or won't?
cannot
Cannot.
cannot stop them.
Logically, or
Metaphysically, cannot. God's mode of operation, modus operandi, is necessarily persuasive. And this is obviously a heated
so
controversy,
this
but
is not by God's choice. This is by the necessity of metaphysical ontology.
that's correct. And again, there's different dimensions that process thinkers argue about, but God cannot interrupt and stop events of horror. Like I just mentioned, God works in every moment, within every event, to do the best God can, persuasively. But only you are the coercive force of the world. Only you can stop these things. So it puts the responsibility back on people, and it means that God is not ultimately culpable for genuine evil. That is evil that makes the world positively worse. Okay, classical theism, traditional theology really struggled with this. And we think it's because they've largely misunderstood divine power and misunderstood divine knowledge and elevated those above the reality of goodness, which is what's at stake in the problem of evil, divine goodness.
I think we quote Exodus 3:14, where the famous thing God says, "I am what I am" at the burning bush to Moses. The Hebrew is very interesting, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which more often, at least in contemporary, would mean "I will be what I will be." So it does indicate a biblical background to the idea that God has movement into a future and is not a changeless being.
Beautifully put. And I think that's a point that's often missed. Some have wanted to use that the Exodus claim as saying God is complete and pure actuality, devoid of possibility, devoid of potentiality. But for the process God is it's not omnipotent, it's omnipotential. in God's life and in God's experience are the very potentials of creation as they unfold. That God is in relation to those in a deep way. So I love that you brought that up.
We ask different traditions in their tradition, how does the apophatic, that you can only know God in the negative, with the cataphatic, you can know positive things about God. How would you describe that apophatic cataphatic tension?
Right. Otherwise known as the negative and affirmative sides of theology. Well, process thinkers, again, are diverse here. You have some who want to take the more apophatic direction and use different thinkers, including Whitehead, to do that. But on the whole, I'd say God's traits, the reality of God, is not purely ineffable. And again, this goes back to the statement that God is not a great exception to the deepest principle of our experience, but God is their greatest exemplification. And that may be hard to swallow for a lot of people in a deep way. It's a big debate. But what that means is that there's continuity between God and God's world, between human beings in relation to God. And so we begin, again, skillfully, strategically, carefully, humbly with our own experience, and are led back and led forward to thinking about God in relation to our experience. So God is not utterly unknowable. We can, in fact, say certain things about God if God too exemplifies the same dimensions of our experience. Of course, not in the way we do, but much more.
There's definitely a coherence to that, which I like. I always like coherence as the first step. Doesn't mean it's right,
me
but
too.
if it's coherent, you're surely wrong. Let's talk about the actions of God. Short answers. According to process theology, was the world, the entire, all reality, created by God?
Yes, I think process thinkers on the whole are going to affirm that, but they do it in such a way that God's creation of the world is the gift of self-creation to the world. And that's an important distinction. It's not a unilateral coercive event. It's a gift of possibility awaiting the world's actualization. It's a relational creation.
Did the universe have a temporal beginning?
Well, this is, of course, a big debate among process thinkers, some of which argue yes, some of which argue no. Whitehead wrote, prior to Big Bang cosmology, he tended to follow Aristotle and Plato in saying that the world did not have an absolute beginning, but it was the incoming of a certain kind of order. So now, post-Big Bang cosmology, process thinkers argue that the Big Bang was the emergence of a certain cosmic epoch, but before which and after which there'll be more. In a way, it's somewhat similar to the proposals of Roger Penrose in that way.
In process theology, did God create the world ex nihilo, out of nothing?
God creates in relation to the world, not ex nihilo, out of absolutely nothing. So process thought is going to critique that concept as incoherent and critique the idea that God could remain alone, independent and isolated without a world, if God wanted to, as also incoherent.
So that means that the world has equal ontological standing with God?
Well, God is necessary in the primordial nature, fluid and changing in the consequent nature. The existence of the world in relation to God has always been there for a process framework in a deep way. Again, some will debate that, but that doesn't mean that the world itself has equal standing. God is ultimate actuality in a deep sense. The world is finite temporal actuality, and God has always been pictured in relation to a world. Not our world, but some world of creative activity, of firing creative finitude. And this is an important point to say that it's not all that controversial. Even Aquinas himself said that the world could be eternal and God would still be its creator in a deep sense. So that's an important point, I think, to bring up.
Does the process God need to sustain the world actively, or does the world, once it had the status that it does, have an independent existence? The thought experiment that if God ceased to exist, which is impossible if it's a necessary being, but still allow the thought.
Glad you said that, yeah.
If that were true, that the world would continue to exist or would not continue to exist?
Would not to continue to exist in principle. But yes, of course, you can't get rid of a necessary being. But God's activity in the world, again, is the provision of every single aim, of every single firing occasion. It's provision of possibility. It's provision of novelty. Whitehead has a great statement that without the immanence of God, novelty would be meaningless. The world, in a sense, would halt in disjointed stagnation. He even has a great statement where he says, apart from the immanence of God, or the immanence of God gives us reason to think that absolute chaos is impossible. And this is a great statement about God's provision, God's sustenance, sustaining activity for the world.
The relationship between the creator and the created, or between God and the world, is a very critical And in Abrahamic religions, it's very clear that there's this great distinction. God is perfectly fine without the world, created the world as a loving event. If the world didn't exist, God would be just fine. I'm exaggerating, of course. In process theology, you've talked about the divine human entanglements in potentiality, actuality, and mentality. How deep does that go?
Okay, great. It goes rather deep, I would say. But before I get that, one way I'd love to explain the relationship between God and the world and process thought is through call and response. And every moment God calls with the provision of possibility awaits the world's response. In a sense, to use the human point of reference, God offers to you, Robert, in every moment the best expression of yourself, but awaits for you to actualize it. And when you do, God incorporates what you've done. So there's a real relationship that's different from just the classical relationship, because what the world does affects God. And the world, in a deep sense, offers God something valuable. Now, this language of potentiality, actuality, possibility, these are important dimensions, because the way in which we have access to possibilities in a deep sense is through our mental dimensions. The way in which God's primordial nature is conceived as a ground of possibilities and infinite mental reality. And so it's mentalities meeting mentalities through the offering of possibilities and decisions for actualities. I mean, that's one way of putting the divine human entanglements quote that you just said.
How does process theology address the problem of evil?
Okay, well, we touched on this briefly, but process theology rethinks what it means for God to have knowledge and what it means for God to be powerful. And it does this on behalf of the preservation of God as good, God as love. For process thought, the classical tradition has not answered in a satisfactory way why it is that God doesn't stop genuine evil if God has the power to do so. And so we believe in a sense, we've misconceived those notions in the tradition, and they require rethinking now. So God is not omnipotent in the classical sense. God is not omniscient in the classical sense.
And so that means that the tension between the all-powerful God and the all-good God is skewed heavily to the all-good. God is all good, but just lacks the power. Is that an oversimplification? I know it's an oversimplification, but
It is an oversimplification, but think of it's sort of, we get to the question of worship again. What kind of power is worthy of worship? The power of Hitler or the power of Mother Teresa? Right, worthy of admiration. The process thought will not elevate power over goodness. Goodness is the primordial trait through which God lives, and all other traits should be seen in light of it, and not succumbing it into these other traits, if you want.
So the process God's approach to the problem of evil would prioritize God's goodness over God's power, and it's this sort of process that the evil just occurs, and that God cannot, certainly does not, but cannot prevent it.
That's right. Divine power on a process scheme is not seen to be coercive. It's not the type of power that can stop horrendous things from happening.
That's quite different from the traditional Christian approach, maybe exemplified by Alvin Plantinger's free will defense,
Right.
where
Right.
God has power, but God just chooses not to intervene in order to protect human freedom. So, very different approach to the problem of evil.
Very different approaches. Plantinger's as a defense rather than a full-blown theodicy, as he himself admits, and he's done some great work, certainly. But David Ray Griffin and Al Plantinga have been in a long debate, emerging with two books by Griffin that are really worth looking at in the theodicy question. One more comment I'll add is that when you look at the power of God in a Christian framework, which is my framework, what do you see in the life of Christ? You don't see an exhibition of overruling power, as Whitehead says. You see a power that is there to be discerned in a persuasive, small way. Like Jung says, most people don't see God because they don't look low enough. The tyrant God with omnipotent power that could stop things and doesn't, I think has done a lot of damage.
Some real short answers to a lot of very specific questions. Does the process God intervene in human affairs, lives of individuals, like prayer and miracles, or the fate and history of nations?
God is actively involved. This is a better way of saying intervention, because intervention assumes, in a way, from an outside in, which God is not outside. God is in, with, and under the entire process of the universe, influencing every single event. Influencing, not determining. So God is not determining the course of history. God is channeling divine value through possibility into the world and awaiting the world to make the choice.
Yeah, it seems like not doing that good of a job.
Well, the world emerged. Evolution emerges, creativity emerges, and the fact that we are here and can combat divine influence may be a shadow side of having a world at all. So you might want to rethink it.
Okay, all right. Does the process God violate the laws of nature when God goes through this process of relating to humans?
No. So a part of the condition for God being the chief exemplification is that God is naturally related. To say God is supernatural usually would assume that God is outside and can violate the natural course of causal relations. For process thinking, God is in, with, and under all of these relations, working in and through them and never violating them.
But at the same time, trying to influence for good and to elevate the value, the totality of value in reality.
Whitehead has a great statement where he says the purpose of God is the attainment of value in the temporal world. The value pursuit is what grounds, I think, God's meeting the world in every moment.
What's the potential for human beings in process theology? Is there life after death of any kind?
So this is a great question. I'm glad you asked. And there's much debate in the process world. Charles Hartshorne, for example, has a great statement where he says that we must finally be content with God being better than us, in the sense that we shouldn't want to become gods ourselves. So he held to only what's called objective immortality, the idea that our life is imprinted on the life of God forever, and that's the only mode of immortality we have.
That's not good enough for me. Is it good enough for you?
Not at all, and I know it's not good enough for you. Well, that's why process thinkers have also talked about subjective immortality. The idea that after our life has passed, we go on living in the life of God as subjects, as individuals. And different thinkers have argued how that works with Whitehead's metaphysics. Whitehead, I should say, was implicitly open to evidence, provided that it's trustworthy. And so process thinkers have investigated near-death experience, again, assuming it's trustworthy, and you can draw certain conclusions from that. So I would agree with you there. Objective immortality alone is not good enough.
Does the process God relate to personal eschatology, the immortality or the resurrection of individual personalities?
I would say yes, on the whole, process thinkers are concerned with this. Process eschatologies have been written that think through these issues quite differently. But on the whole, yes, God is related to even the eschatological consummation of things, assuming we understand that in a certain way. So, yes.
So what is that certain way that would differentiate it from the typical Abrahamic?
Well, if the future is open and undetermined, this means that there are not, say, eschatological events that must take place in a certain way. So some language that process thinkers have used is collaborative eschatology. So God is not determining the world from behind, but if you want, it's helpful to see God pulling the universe from ahead. God is in the domain of the possible. And God is luring the world into a future that is undetermined, and therefore that the eschatological events are not laid in stone already. So it's a collaborative venture.
There's this very interesting phrase that I saw that that become God so that God can become you, or God became man so that man could become God. And you've described it as something that's not chronological or eschatological, which is the way it sounds, but rather reciprocal and momentarily. How do you parse that?
Great. That's a great question. It's I see you've read my paper. Okay, so the church fathers said that God became man so that man could become God. And often this was seen in a sort of eschatological way. And of course, the incarnation would be the movement of God towards the world. Theosis, as the tradition has called it, would be the movement of the world or human beings toward God. I think now you can see this momentarily rather than eschatologically or chronologically, in the sense that God is, again, providing God's self as possibility. The nature of God is providing God's self as possibility. The world is actualizing it. In a deep sense, you, in actualizing the reality of God, are being elevated into the life of God in a deep way. You are actualizing God. God is sustaining you. So I think these movements of theosis, these movements of incarnation can be seen creatively in the moment. Of course, theology is not just about affirming what's true for me. Theology is about affirming the truth in the most creative and beautiful possible way. So that's a creative way of thinking about that statement by the church fathers.
is process philosophy and theology universalist, which means whatever the eschatological plan is, or however it happens, however God's involved, it's not relevant to this question. The question is, whatever happens, all human beings included in that category, or will there be some kind of separation based on some judgment or arbitrary decision?
It's very hard, Robert, to be separated from an omnipresent God. uh, so process thought on the whole is going to lean towards universalist scenarios. Now that doesn't mean some won't disagree with that. There's work being done on that now. God enters the hell of our lives even in this world, and if there should be a domain of hell, a state or whatever, I'm not a big fan of that. That God is there too, and the question becomes: how is God there? Is God there as a condemning reality or a redemptive reality? And so process thought on the whole is going to say that God is a redemptive reality that is trying to pull us out of hell, whether on earth or or post earth, if you want. But on the whole, God is working for the salvation of everyone.
Yeah, granted all of that. Granted all of that. The question: will everyone, without exception, people talk about Hitler and Stalin, without exception, be in that category?
I'd like to make a bold claim that yes, they will. It's a hope. It's not a absolutely confident
Okay.
claim. But why should a hope not become a confidence?
Okay, I'm with you on that. Let's move on to process metaphysics, and we some short answers here would be good. According to process philosophy, what is ultimate reality? What exists, which is one of our favorite closer to truth question, what exists? And by that I mean, what are the fundamental, non-reducible categories of all reality?
Great question. Okay, well, so process theology, philosophy, again, I want to emphasize the fact that it's diverse, holds not simply to ultimate reality, but ultimate actuality. Ultimate reality in Whitehead's thought is creativity. It's the creative advance into novelty, and it is ultimate. But the wonderful thing he says, somewhat like Aristotle's prime matter, is that creativity is nothing except in its embodiments. And so, in addition to ultimate reality of creativity, there is the ultimate actuality of God. These are two ultimates. If you want, they are inseparably related and embody each other.
One is kind of an action, a process. Pardon the pun, and the other is a substance. I mean, there is differences between action and substances.
Right, but the ranking of inferior and or better or worse between them doesn't make sense when the relationship is one of mutual immanence. They live through each other. They're each requiring of the other for their own being. And creativity is not an entity. It's not a being. It is a formless process.
But it has to operate on something.
It operates in and through actuality, and God is the primordial character shaping creativity. So again, there's not a ranking between them, but a mutuality.
So I'm just trying to get my category. So one category, God is this ultimate substance, and then I have creativity, which is a very nice idea, and maybe value or good, which we talked about earlier, as idea processes. But they have to work on something, so there has to be some other substance there in addition to God, where God can do the creativity. And so, is that substance also a non-reducible category?
Right. Yes, but we're not going to use the language of substance. Process thinkers despise that language. In part, that's what they combat against. But yes, so in addition to creativity as the ultimate reality, in addition to God as the ultimate actuality, there are actual entities. So this is a third category of ultimate being, and these are events that happen and that continually happen as embodiments of creativity. And in addition, we must add the fourth and final, at least for Whitehead, which is eternal objects. These are these Platonic-like forms, okay, not Platonic totally in Plato's sense, but that they're forms of definiteness, they are possibilities for actualization that are really there. And it's the confluence and the entanglement of these four dimensions of creativity, of God, of actual entities, of possibility, that is the metaphysical grounds of the world that we experience.
Okay, that's a great answer to the what exists question. I think we covered that. Okay, now our other favorite: why is there something rather than nothing? How does process theology deal with that question? What is the ultimate? What are the things that have absolute necessity so that question goes away?
Great. So I'm assuming you're not saying that absolute nothingness is an actual possibility. in asking the question. So it's an ontological question that's been posed all throughout history. But I, for one, I think, and maybe we'll disagree here, I don't, as soon as somebody affirms something necessary in their ontology, absolute nothingness is an impossibility. I think that's an important point. So it's also an important point to say that being or nothingness are not necessarily relevant or real options. So, for example, Whitehead never asks the ontological question because becoming itself, if you want, which sort of merges being and nothingness together, is what's fundamental.
If becoming is fundamental, then nothing goes away. Part of the double negative.
Yes, right, exactly. But of course, as you know, there's various ways to answer this question. We've all benefited from your work with Leslie. I'm most attracted to and compelled by those solutions that would look to the ultimacy of value or the ultimacy of mind in reasoning why there should be anything at all. I think these together, in a certain way, transcend and offer more solutions than either a blank slate, no explanation, or chance would. So I think they're important. It's an important part of the tradition to affirm value at the base of existence and to think through what that means with respect to mind.
Yeah, I love John Leslie, but he and I debate the issue of the primacy of value.
Yes.
The process God, we've already said, can't know the future because the future is not knowable, correct?
That's correct.
What is the causation process? Does causation require anything beyond the physical?
Causation is an important place in process thought. If we take the structure of an event that emerges at the fundamental base of things, every event emerges through the efficient causation of the past. That is, the past is settled, it's physical if you want, and it influences what the event does. It doesn't fully determine the event. For Whitehead, for process thinkers, there's also the reality of final causation. This is the mental dimension wherein we evaluate possibility and make a decision that is free. So both efficient and final causation are essential to a process world. And of course, if the final causation wasn't there and it was only determining efficient causation, the world would lack novelty in a deep way. What injects novelty is in the world, what allows for purpose in our personal lives, is the fact of final causation, that we choose what to do with the possibilities before us.
We've not heretofore mentioned consciousness, which is a very critical part of in many religions. It's foundational that consciousness is everything. In some cases, consciousness is the primordial thing, and if there are things like God, it comes from consciousness. In process theology, how do you deal with consciousness, and what is the relationship between the process God and consciousness?
Okay, great. Yeah, and we could speak on this on human levels, but let's focus on the theological first. So for Whitehead, it speaks about God as the primordial mind. Again, this mind has, if you want, abstract dimensions, unconscious dimensions. In the consequent nature, however, it is fully conscious. So God is properly conceived as a conscious mind that is aware, that is intending, that is in relationship to the world. So I think in that respect, process thought is agreeing with a lot of what the tradition has said, at least basically. The way it frames that is quite different. But then again, experience in the wider world is more fundamental than consciousness. In human experience, we see the evolution of experience and the crowning, the dawning of consciousness. And that's an important distinction, which means various sorts of things.
Experience is more important than consciousness. Now, those seem like different kinds of things that you can't. Normally, you think those are non-comparable. You're ranking them. You're saying experience is more important than consciousness, but the natural rejoinder is, how can you experience without consciousness?
Well, I didn't say it's more important. So that'd be a value ranking. I said it's more fundamental. That consciousness itself in the world emerges out of complexly structured and layered experiences. So it's a genuine evolutionary phenomenon. Conscious is in human experience, but consciousness doesn't go all the way down, and that seems clear. But experience does, and the reason it's important to say that this pan-experientialist claim is the debate in the philosophy of mind. How on earth does experience or consciousness emerge from quantities that are purely devoid of experience and consciousness?
So is your experience of things that change, and it's in the sense that things that are experiences don't have to be conscious, but they are experiences, and in some way or in some part of the experience of reality, consciousness emerged or occurred.
It did on an evolutionary trajectory, absolutely. The claim is, though, that experience, as a mode of feeling, as a mode of interiority, goes all the way down in nature, and that eases the tension of saying how how consciousness itself can emerge from vacuous actuality. Instead, consciousness emerge as a deepening of, in the evolutionary process, a deepening of experience. It's much more complicated, of course, than we'll get into, but that's the claim. Some call it panpsychism. Whitehead didn't like the term, but pan-experientialism has generally been the way that process thinkers have thought about that.
Well, Andrew, my experience with this rapid course in process philosophy and theology has been great. It has enlarged my consciousness, and I hope we'll do more of it in the future.
Robert, thank you. I hope so as well. Appreciate the invite.